Earlier, I spoke with someone who learned firsthand how problematic gambling can be. Tom Eaton. I started by asking him how his addiction began. Have a watch.
So my story began probably, I don't know, when I was 17, 18. It was minor gambling at that point, just a few pound here and there in the bookies. It probably got worse as the years went on, and predominantly when online gambling come into play. And that's when it really spiraled out of control for me, really.
You were working for Dunelm as
Correct.
a finance manager, and your story, and it's so candid of you, and it's really important for the basis of what we're talking about, online gambling and people with addictions, that being fed by, the ability for people with few checks to just get huge amounts of credit. You stole more than £250,000 to fund this addiction. How did you do that?
A lot of ways that, obviously I'm not proud of in any shape or form. Being a manager, I had a lot of responsibility there, which meant that a lot of the things I did probably went under the radar. I was getting credit cards out of my name. Money that was due to be refunded back to the company was coming back directly to my bank account. Obviously, like I said, it's not a time I'm particularly proud of in my life.
Listen, years ago, I don't know if you know this about me, I had a problem with gambling, so I completely get that this is difficult, not maybe cathartic, probably difficult to open up about it. But opening up about it is not condoning it. In fact, what it does is it perhaps highlights how it can grab people and the responsibility of these organisations that I think, should stand up and be counted. You spontaneously confessed to your bosses. I mean, as the debt built between you and me, you knew you were going to be caught, didn't you?
100%. And I think that's half of the reason why it got to the stage it did. I was so afraid of getting caught as such, afraid of what I stood to lose. I knew that I'd obviously lose my job, I'd lose my career, there's losing friendships, family. So all of that was obviously playing on my mind. And the hope,
mindset, of course, that you're going to have the big victory and put it all back, because that's what all gamblers have, right? It's just round the corner.
Exactly. That was always my intention as well. I gambled more to pay more back, but because I was in such a spiral, I was losing more and it was just a continuous circle of bad decisions, basically.
It's just a hamster wheel of it's so terrifying and so terrible, and I'm totally with you. But you did own up. You were jailed for 27 months. At that moment, when that gavel went down and you are heading to jail, what are you thinking?
Just how I've let everyone down. I was married at the time. I've got 2 young kids, and the thought of being away from them was always the worst thing. I'm not by any stretch the most strongest person, maybe mentally or physically, but I knew that I could just crack on with it. But being away from people, that was the worst bit for me.
It's absolutely true to say, actually, not just in your words, but the judge in the case said he was revolted by the tactics this particular company, BetSafe, used to reel you in, knowing that you were sinking in a sea of debt. They showered you with personal gifts. Just tell us a bit about that, because no responsibility from them to do something about somebody who was obviously floundering big time.
Well, that's it, yeah. I mean, I was getting given free money to gamble with. It was into the thousands bracket. They contacted me directly through WhatsApp and said that my account manager wanted to speak to me because he'd got tickets to a Man City game. All expenses paid for in a box. We got things like that. And every time, I mean, I always point back to messages I was getting. And I said to my account manager, I'm really struggling, I'm not winning anything. And he goes, here's £500, hopefully your luck will change. And
I mean, that could almost, wrong word perhaps, but that's almost predatory, isn't it? Because they presumably knew that you were in that terrible cycle of well, let's be honest, you con yourself, you lie to everybody, you believe in your mind that it's just round the corner, as we said, and even at those moments when you probably want to throw in the towel and go, I can't do this, they're reeling you in with more and more. Do you, and this is a really important point, I think, for the show, and that, what I love about your story, I spoke to Holes, is that you don't blame anybody else. But when you look at it as I do, the online companies need to take huge responsibility, don't they? I mean, we're not saying they forced you to gamble in the first place, but certainly when those red flags were raised, they didn't do anything to help you.
No, I mean, I've always used the word accountability, and I've always took accountability for my actions. You know, they didn't hold a gun to my head. They didn't tell me to steal money. Like that was on me, and I live with that now for the rest of my life. But yeah, there needs to be some sort of, again, accountability with these companies. They have these procedures, alleged procedures in place. They have these licenses. They constantly break all of the conditions of these licenses, and nothing ever gets done about it. And
I mean, online gambling, some of the controls are ludicrous, and certainly in my mind, doing this, it's to highlight the fact that there should be greater control. What I love about what you just said, Tommy, is that nobody held a gun to your head. You did it. Do you think that if online gambling, that's so obvious to us all, 24 hours a day, you can bet on how many buses are going to turn up, where it's going to snow on December the 25th, you can do it online 24 hours a day. Do you think your particular story would have been the same? Because as you said, they didn't force you to steal. Do you think that you and the addiction, the thrill, the rush, the, I'm going to sort this out, do you think that would have been there anyway?
Potentially, maybe not to the extent that it did. I'd like to think if I didn't have everything at the touch of my fingertips, then maybe I could have dealt with things a little bit better. Again, it's not blaming anyone else. It's nothing along them lines. It's more trying to figure out, in my mind, would I have gone down that same path? I personally don't think I would, because I always did most of my gambling online. Mm-hmm. I always had this mindset of I could never justify handing cash over. Whereas obviously with online, it's just digits, it's just numbers. It doesn't feel real.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'm really, really proud of you doing this, and I mean that. What about now? How are you doing now, kiddo?
Yeah, life's different now. Unfortunately, me and my wife split up. But we get on well for the children. I've got shared custody of the kids. I have them nearly half the time each week. I've got my own place. I'm moving forward. I'm doing well at work, and life's busy. But I still have moments. I've had relapses. I still have to try and figure out in my mind how I manage the addiction and because it'll always be with me. Mm-hmm. It doesn't just go away. It's unfortunate that's me now, and it's just about how I try and manage all these triggers and keep on the right path, really.
Fascinating. Joining me to discuss this now is a man who specialises in addiction, neuropsychopharmacologist. How about that, Professor David Nutt? And in the studio, co-founder of the Gamblers Consumer Forum, Abby McGregor. Welcome both. Abby, if I can start with you. I want to sort of split this programme into different segments. I want to start by talking about the causes of addiction, but perhaps the warning signs. So if you are a gambler, we've both been chatting, during that interview, that we both have a punt. What are the warning signs that it becomes more than that? And what about, not only should one look for, but what about people around you?
Well, I think what that video shows is that there are two distinct groups of people. The over 99% of healthy gamblers who gamble and don't need to be subject to any restrictions, and those small amounts that are addicted. And there is a clear cognitive difference between those two groups of people. Because if there wasn't, why isn't everybody addicted? We have to get away from this idea that everyone could be one better way from addiction. And there are all sorts of warning signs that we can see that aren't to do with money, because that's just a means to access the addiction, that aren't to do with your spending habits. What they're to do with is evidence of compulsion. You must gamble regardless of the consequences.
Interesting. David, welcome to Jeremy Kyle Investigates. Can you, from your point of view, why do gambling addictions occur for people?
Well, gambling addictions are part of a series of other addictions, and they all occur because there's a network in the brain, which is an incentive network, which drives people to do things that give them pleasure. And that for most of us, we can balance the pleasures with the pain. But in addictions, and it's certainly gambling addiction is one of them. The once you start to get into that routine of looking for the pleasure, with gambling, you don't get much of it. You've got to do an awful lot of work to get the odd reward.
I would say not pleasure, having been there myself. I think it's the rush. I think it's the thrill. I think it's that opportunity to achieve something you don't want. Is there one particular person, I mean a sort of type of person, David, who is susceptible to gambling addiction, or can it strike anybody?
Well, there are vulnerability factors. So there are people who have poor impulse control. There are people who have obsessive compulsive tendencies. Those are the two sort of main groups of people who get vulnerable. And then there are the others who accidentally win a lot to start with, and then find that they sort of flip their brain into a state where they feel that they're always going to win. So they kind of, the first lucky winners are more vulnerable than the others.
It's interesting what Abby said. Abby says that we have to be careful not to say that every single gambler, because there's many, I mean, there might be 300,000 problem gamblers. That was from the DCMS on the government website. But there's millions of people that have a bet in this country, David, who do not have an addiction. How do we find the difference? What's the answer?
Well, we think the answer is to do a bit more research, actually, to try to look at what those vulnerability factors are. Some of them will be genetic. Some of them will definitely be in how the brain responds to the cues of addiction. I mean, we've done some very elegant work looking at how the brains of people light up when you show them the particular gambling cues that they enjoy, and we can show that gamblers do have a very distorted preference for things like roulette wheels or playing cards, and they also, importantly, they have a deficiency of getting positive reactivity to what gives most of us pleasure, like conversations or nature or pets or family.
Interesting. Can I just bring you back in, Abby, before we move on? Lots to talk about in the next hour. You make that point that we have to be very careful, that we don't jump on a bandwagon and say all gamblers are wrong. Who do you believe is responsible for finding the difference? How are we going to do it? Briefly, what's the answer?
Well, I think first you have to be able to identify them, and in order to do that...
Well, should that be the company? Should it be the individual? Everybody's having a go, maybe rightly, about these companies seducing people. That story, that company was appalling. They were giving him free money to gamble. Theirs is a responsibility, but it was in him before they worked on his vulnerability? I don't know.
Well, I think the bookmakers have to have harm markers to flag up possible signs of addictive behaviour. But it's important that those harm markers are clinical and cognitive indicators. They are not to do with people's spending habits. Addiction is cognitive. Whether you believe you can catch it from a casino, which I do not believe is true, or it's to do with, as David said, the dopamine regulation in your brain, it's a cognitive clinical condition and it must be treated as such.